Can you use strength training alone to improve your VO2 max and other endurance parameters? And is high intensity resistance training actually better than endurance training to build those qualities? At least that's what some people claim. Today, I'll try to answer this topic to the best of my ability. Thanks to Soren for sending me his question. I'm going to read his question out to you, and then I'm going to go through my response. I've already outlined a response, so I have the main points to go through. We're going to talk about specificity. We're going to talk about cost of training, and we're going to talk about what the goal is and what the population that we're working with is to consider the response to this question. So without any further ado, let me read you Soren's question. So the question goes as follows. It is my observation that you make the typical association between the aerobic part of our metabolism and cardiovascular health. I would like to ask why you do that, because in my mind, our cardiovascular system supplies the entirety of the cell and not just the mitochondria. So if we place a higher demand on the working tissue, the local muscle, we automatically demand more from the vasculature to supply that tissue, hereby a greater stimulus for improvement for mitochondria density and respiration, and capillary improvement in terms of development density. We can both agree that it's two essential biomarkers that will improve our health. I would like you to scientifically explain why we can't fully develop those biomarkers just by using high intensity strength training. So really the crux and the main question here is, why can't we fully develop mitochondrial density, mitochondrial respiration, and capillary density just by doing high intensity training, strength training? And I believe from the reference that he sent to me that this high intensity training, strength training refers to strength training taken to muscular failure. So let me go through a few thoughts when it comes to answering this. So strength training improves VO2 max in trained and untrained populations, mostly in untrained populations. We've seen that. It's referenced in the paper that you sent me, Soren, and it is well documented. If people want more information, go check out my VO2 max article on my site. I talk about this in there. So yes, for untrained people or for people that are out of shape or beginners, improvement in strength and strength training per se will improve VO2 max parameters. However, we do not see improvements in VO2 max if we consider that to be a main cardiovascular index in terms of both health and performance. We do not see improvement in VO2 max in trained people. So already we have a consideration here that is that for trained populations, resistance training or strength training, even to failure, is not enough to improve that VO2 max. So that is a part of an answer. Then resistance training is better than cardiovascular exercise. I think that is a bold claim, and I don't know where we can actually find veracity in that. Better for what? What are we measuring? What's the outcome that we're seeking? Is it an improvement in VO2 max per se? Is it an improvement in performance in an endurance activity? I think we have to define those things better if we want to compare. That is another point. The cost of work is a big one, and I'll try to put a graph on the screen here. How much does it cost you to do the work? The paper that you referenced, Soren, mentions how the investment in high intensity strength training can be very interesting, especially for beginners, because it doesn't cost a lot of time, because it's very intense, it's very hard. And I see in that the same argument as what I have seen as well in sprint interval training research, SIT. And sprint interval training, for those who don't know what it is, often called Wingate sprints, all out sprints from, say, 6 to 30 seconds, repeated multiple times in a session. I've done those sessions. I've prescribed those sessions. They're some of the hardest sessions you can do on a bike. And I find it nice that researchers say, well, it takes only 2 minutes of work, so it's really easy. And then beginners can really benefit from that. Those studies are brutal, man. 3 days a week, 3 times 30 seconds all out with 4 minute rest. Those are really, really hard sessions. And we have to consider how much this work costs. And just because it doesn't take a lot of time, the whole time efficiency argument for me is just a fallacy in the sense that the point of exercise or the point of coaching and programming is not to find the thing that's going to give you the most improvement for the least amount of time spent, period. That is not the way that we have to think about training and picking different modalities and means of training. I think we have to consider also the investment that it takes from an energetic and from a mental standpoint. Because if the work that you prescribe is the best, quote unquote, just because it's short and it doesn't take a lot of time, however, your athletes are burnt out because you're only giving them the hardest stuff to do all the time, that is a terrible idea. And that's terrible coaching, in my opinion. And so we have to consider the cost of this work. And so it might look on paper like it's very efficient because it doesn't take a lot of time. How many of those sessions can you do back to back before you just want to give up training altogether? That's my question with the sprint interval training studies is sure, he did 6 weeks or 8 weeks of sprint interval training, and it yields the same results as low intensity endurance. How many 8 week cycles of some of the hardest training you've ever done can you do back to back until you literally implode? And that's a conversation that we're not having. And I think it has to be at the center here. Yes, it's efficient from a time perspective. Yes, it seems like we can get similar adaptations, at least in untrained people, compared to regular cardiovascular or endurance modalities. But the cost of this work is tremendous. And that's also another reason why I think we cannot fully develop those biomarkers just with high intensity strength training. It's because at some point you have to do work that costs you less so you can do more of it. And we know that volume is not the determinant of performance, but it's one factor that we have to take into account. And if you're training 10 hours a week because you're using all the easiest or the fastest means of training, it's very unlikely that you're ever going to beat someone who trains 30 or 35 hours a week because the volume itself is a big driver of adaptation. And in order to accumulate that high volume, you cannot just do things really, really hard all the time. So that has to come into the conversation. Then we can talk about the specificity of adaptations. What I mean by that is when you train at high intensity, well, you're going to recruit certain motor units and you're going to fatigue those motor units. And what you want is, if you want the best bang for your buck, is to try and drive adaptation in all your tissue, right? Type 1 fibers, type 2 fibers, and try to develop all of this together. Why do we have to pick one? Why do we have to only pick one mode of training? Why does it only have to be the high intensity stuff? Why can it not be both? I think that's something that's toxic is a big word, that is not helpful, I believe, in the current conversation around training. The non-helpful part is to have to pick sides. Why do we have to pick sides? Why do we have to pick strength training versus endurance training? Why can't we just do both? I mean, everybody does both. Anybody who performs at a very high level does both. Yeah, but strength training is not useful because the Norwegians, the triathletes, they don't do strength training. Well, listen to what their coach says about this and you'll understand the rationale. But outside of this, most of other athletes through and through do endurance work and they do strength work. And those that are at the top of the game rarely do just one thing. They do a whole bunch of things and they do it really well. So if you want those adaptations, you need to also, well, diversify the work and target and recruit those motor units and fatigue them if you want those adaptations. You will not become better at developing durability, sustainability of effort. You will not be able to do this with the failure work and sprint interval training work. It's just not going to happen. If you need to be good on the 3 hour race, you need to train for that. And that's going to mean doing longer stuff as well as doing the resistance training. Mitochondrial development in type 2 fibers is another thing I wanted to cover. We know that yes, we can develop type 2 fibers to a high degree. We know that mitochondria can improve above the levels of what we might find in untrained type 1 fibers. So initially we used to say that type 1 fibers have the biggest propensity for improving mitochondrial density and capillary density. It seems like that's true. However, for somebody that's highly trained, their type 2 fibers might have a better mitochondrial density and capillary density than the type 1 fibers of someone who doesn't train and who is untrained. So we know that we can develop mitochondria and capillary in the type 2 fibers, but you just have so much bigger pool and opportunity for improvement in type 1 fibers. And again, why do we have to pick one side? Why can't we just do both? Because at the end of the day, we're just going to be better if we develop both sides of the equations. We know that type 1 fibers support type 2 fibers in intense efforts. I mean, I've seen people improve their gymnastic endurance by doing a bike program because we know that the legs are going to help the upper body when the upper body's in the red or doing hard. They work together. And that's really my conclusion and trying to answer this question is why do we have to pick one? Why do we have to pick high intensity strength training? Why do we have to pick high intensity sprints versus low intensity endurance? If we just look at what all the best are doing and we don't just go cherry picking studies that please our own biases, um, we can see that they do a whole bunch of stuff. They do mostly easy stuff and a little bit of really hard stuff. And this seems to be a good balance to make things work. Simply because if it's high intensity, if it's hard, you can only do so much of it. And once you've exceeded that amount, you're going to plateau, you're going to hurt yourself, or you're going to get demotivated because of how unfit you are. And that's really what I've seen in my experience so far in the few years working in the field is people that claim to be able to do everything off of high intensity alone. Well, just wait a couple years and then go back to that person and ask them how they're doing. I guarantee they're not doing well, or they're not telling you the whole story, or they're operating on means that are beyond the scope of this podcast. What I'm saying is we need a balance of both. We need the hard stuff, we need the strength training, we need the hard intervals, we need the sprints, but we also need the easy stuff, the longer stuff to complement it, to support it. The low intensity is really about endurance, about resisting fatigue, about recovering faster, about tolerating more training. And that's where I see it. The low intensity stuff, if you want to flip it that way, just tell yourself that you're doing low intensity so you can do more high intensity. And that's a totally fair way to think about it. But I don't think we should pick sides. I don't think we should hit those modalities against each other and try to justify, well, I think I'm team this, so all we have to do is this, or I think I'm team that, so all we have to do is that. I don't understand why we would go down those rabbit holes and trying to justify a position that frankly is untenable, simply because of what the research has shown in terms of what is necessary to perform at the highest level. Now, if that's not the conversation that you're in and you're trying to achieve different goals and you want to have the best adaptations with the least amount of time spent training, then absolutely strength interval training and with sprint interval training and high intensity strength training are the way to go. But again, how long are you going to be able to run that train until the wheels fall off the wagon? That is my question. And this is why I don't operate that way. This is why, yes, high intensity for beginners is great. But if you only do that when they can't progress with their intensity anymore because they're fried, well, doing more intensity is not the answer. And so why not start building that base earlier on, because we know that the base endurance, the durability, the resistance to fatigue, the work capacity, this only improves over a career. It never stops if you train properly. Cyclists will tell you they've been in the pro circles, pro level for 10 years, 15 years, and their VO2 max isn't moving anymore. Their threshold is barely moving, but their fundamental endurance, their base training, their zone 2, that keeps going up every year, and they're pushing the limits on durability and resistance to fatigue and being able to produce high levels of effort, elite levels of effort after a 5 hour cycling race. This is what is being done on the field, and I don't work in those spaces, but I've had feedback from coaches that work in the NFL, that work in the NBA, that work in professional rugby, telling me about how unfit these high level quote unquote athletes actually are. And I'm not saying this to poo poo those people. I have the most tremendous amount of respect for coaches and athletes at any level of sport. What they were saying is simply relative to what they could be and relative to maybe what they should have in terms of work capacity and recovery capacity at their level, they just don't. And because it seems like at those levels, in those leagues, the culture is completely around that high intensity, that give everything you got. There's no easy work. There's no zone 2. There's no easy stuff. And I see it as something that can be improved. Am I saying that I could do better if I was in their position? Probably not. What I'm saying is from my current perspective and my current understanding, and from feedback that I've gotten from people in those areas, there seems to be some work to be done on the endurance side, on the base training, on the zone two stuff, on the really easy stuff that nobody is doing because they think it's useless because it doesn't look like their sport. And that's maybe another side of this argument. It's not about, well, why would we use something else if we can get the best adaptations just using strength training? It's more of a, it doesn't look like my sport. I need to run fast and be very explosive for my sport. So why would I train slowly? And I did a video on this on my French channel yesterday. And the Coles notes of that conversation is that it's like passing a math test. If you have a math exam, well, we know that one of the best ways to get good at passing a math exam is just to do the problems, to solve as many problems as possible that you're going to find in the test, or the kinds of problems you're going to find in the test, and just solve as many as you can. And the more you solve, the better you get at solving them, and the better your outcome on the actual test. And that's fair and square. And we could say that, well, then you have to be specific to the test and just work on the problems from the test. Yes, you do. But if you don't have the fundamental understanding of the equations that are necessary to solve the problems in question, you will not be able to solve those problems efficiently. And you might as well go back to the fundamentals and then learn the equations and learn how to use them and apply them to your problems. And then go from that base of understanding. That's how I see zone two in low intensity training. We're not doing it because it looks like your sport. We're not doing it because you want to be slow on the field of play. We're doing it so that you can train more. We're doing it so that you can recover faster. We're doing it so that you can train harder. And I've seen it over and over again in high intensity sports like MMA, like CrossFit. I mean, I work primarily in CrossFit and endurance sports and combat sports, and that's just what I see, every day now at this point with the feedback that I get from people following the programs, people just applying what I talk about. That stuff works, and it enhances the high intensity stuff, right? The At least my perspective on zone two and low intensity and endurance training is not that it's not that it's magic. It's just that it's complementary to everything else that you're already doing, right? I'm not in the debate of you should stop what you're doing and only do zone two. I think that's maybe for a period of time. For some people, in some contexts, that's the answer. But for most people, it's just add a little bit of easy work in your week and everything will work better, period. That's as far as the recommendation goes. So I'll probably leave it here, and just conclude by saying that I don't know why I don't know why you would need someone, Soren. I'm saying this to your question specifically. I don't know why you would need somebody to scientifically explain why we did need to do all these other things in order to increase mitochondrial density and capillary density, if that's what we're focused on. If we can only do it by strength training, I don't think we can do it only by strength training. I think the study that you linked is interesting. And it says that, yes, we can improve endurance parameters with strength training, but it doesn't say that it's going to get you to the highest level of VO2 that you can get for your potential. It doesn't tell you that it has any transfer or impact on endurance performance. It actually says that it doesn't improve anything on the endurance performance side of things. And if you're just out there to improve your health, then you need strength training, you need endurance training, and you need to be able to move your joints. And if you can do those three things over time for the rest of your life, you should be pretty good. So I'll probably leave it at that. Why pick one or the other when you could just do both? And I hope I was able to answer your question and bring a little bit of clarity to these points. Thanks for watching the video. Thanks for coming on the English channel, and we'll see you in the next one.